Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the Outdoor Art Club presentation, What's the Big Idea? I look at understanding and appreciating art. I'm Robin Geisler, and I'm working with my fellow OAC team member, Diane Wagner, to bring you today's program. As you know, we're using the Zoom platform. Our team has worked very hard to master all that Zoom has to offer, but we still find that things don't always go our way, so please be patient with us. For those of you who are not familiar with the Outdoor Art Club, we're a nonprofit women's organization founded in 1902. The club engages in civic, cultural, and charitable work in our community. To give you an idea of some of our past contributions, almost 100 years ago, the club sponsored and helped staff a local well baby clinic that ran for decades. This past year, the club granted funds to the Marine Mammal Center to purchase a whale necropsy kit so that the center could determine the cause of death for whales that wash ashore in Northern California. And every year, the Outdoor Art Club runs a public speaker series so that people like you have the opportunity to learn about topics as varied as the latest research in our battle against the coronavirus and understanding and appreciating modern art. Before I turn this program over to today's program chair, please note that Zoom has two different functions, one for chat and one for Q&A. We'll be using both functions today, but for very different purposes. Julie Charles will pose several questions during her presentation, and she'd like you to use chat as an easy way to send your responses. We'll use the Q&A function for you to send your individual questions to Julie anytime during her presentation. She will leave time to answer your questions at the end of her program. And at this time, I'd like to introduce Becky Smith. Becky is a member of the Outdoor Art Club and program chair for today's event. Thank you, Becky. Thank you for bringing us today's fascinating program, What's the Big Idea? A look at understanding and appreciating art.
Thank you, Robin. I'd like to welcome everyone, and I'm so pleased to be here today to introduce our speaker, Julie Charles, who is SF MOMA's Deborah and Kenneth Novak Director of Education. Julie oversees the school, teacher, and family and guide programs at SF MOMA. She has been teaching in different capacities and forums for 20 plus years. I think she started in middle school. She's also teaches art history at the Berkeley Extension and the Academy of Art University, giving lectures and leading docent training and teacher professional development at other museums, including the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco, the San Jose Museum of Art, and also leading docent training and teacher development, teacher professional development workshops at other museums. In addition to the museums that I mentioned earlier, she also has traveled to the Anderson Collection at Stanford and the Asian Art Museum. Julie has also presented and led workshops at educational conferences locally and nationally. In 2019, Julie was named Art Educator of the Year by the National Art Education Association Pacific Region. She's also won the San Francisco Unified School District's Visual and Performing Art Department, Performing Arts Department Dreamcatcher Award. And I am happy to sing Julie's praises. I have been the recipient of many of her trainings, and I can tell you that you're in for a treat. Julie grew up in the Bay Area and lives in San Francisco with her husband, Russell, her 11-year-old son, Ben, and her rescue dog, Daisy. So Julie is going to talk with us today about what's the big idea, a close look at conceptual art. Welcome, Julie.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you, Robin. Thank you, Becky, for such a kind introduction. As Robin said, there'll be moments in my presentation today where I'm going to ask you to use the chat as a way of having a conversation. And the work that I do at SF MOMA is really grounded in this idea of participatory discussions and dialogue and interactions. And I actually think that that's also fitting for the topic today. So if you'll just bear with me for just a moment, I am going to share my screen with you all. And let's get this into presentation mode for you so you don't see my messy desktop, much to my husband's chagrin. He says, "Why does it look like that?" I tell him I'm in the art world. So today we're going to be thinking about what's the big idea. We're going to be thinking about conceptual art, but we're also going to be thinking about sort of the conceptual threads. As I said, I like my presentations to be a bit conversational. So I'm going to start us off with a question that I like to use when I'm teaching a class or leading a tour. I like to ask people, what's your criteria for art? What are the qualities or characteristics that something needs to have for you to say, yep, that's art? In other words, how do you know art when you see it? So if you wouldn't mind just using the chat to put a few ideas there about what's the criteria that you have for art. I'm seeing something that moves you, so something that really resonates, something that shows originality and craftsmanship. Something that makes me think, showing creativity, something that not just makes you think, but also makes you feel. This sort of expression of creativity, something original that captures your attention, purely aesthetics, something that's in a museum, so the context, or a gallery, so you know about this, you know how to pay attention to it. Seeing a lot of craftsmanship and intellect, speaking to your intellect, your emotions, your spirits, your senses, something that challenges you, something that someone has intentionally created, mood and emotion, something that can be experienced through the senses, something that's visually pleasing, something that's original or presents something in a new way, some intentionality in there. So these are a lot of the things that come up in my tours and my talks, these ideas that you've expressed. And the other things that I sometimes hear too have to do with the role of the artist, right? Or thinking about someone like a Michelangelo who is divinely inspired to create something that has value. I saw in the chat here this idea of the context, where something is, something that's in a museum or in a gallery. So something that has been maybe vetted. And then, of course, as you say, the things that have meaning. And when we think about kind of a traditional idea, going back to the Renaissance of the function of art, sort of great art with the capital A was art that was really sort of a window onto the natural world. And when we think about conceptual art and even much of modern and contemporary art, there's a bit about sort of challenging that traditional notion. And so today, as we think about, as we're thinking about our definition of conceptual art, I want us to be thinking about this idea of conceptual art where the idea or the concept behind the work is more important than the finished object. And the term is usually responding or referring to art that was made in the mid-60s and mid-70s. But in today's conversation, we're going to be looking back a bit and we're going to be looking forward a bit as well. Many of the artists in this moment, associated with this moment, particularly in the 60s, were attempting to bypass what was an increasingly commercialized art world by stressing the thought processes and the methods of production as the value of the work. Artists were, in many ways, reacting against the commercialism and the commercialized world of the 1960s. So think artists like you're seeing in the slide here on your left, Andy Warhol's soup can, so a pop artist like Andy Warhol. But they were also reacting against the impersonality of minimalism. And so on the right, I'm showing you a stack piece or a sculpture by the artist Donald Judd. When we think about artists reacting to that, we can think about examples such as these two. Conceptual artists such as Joseph Kosuth on the left and LeWitt on the right, Saul LeWitt, were really embracing some different qualities in their works, things like language and text, the idea of performance, unorthodox materials. Time and space were also central issues to all of these artists, as well as the shifting relationship between the artist and the viewer. I appreciate that in some of your responses, you acknowledge your own role, in terms of recognizing art, something that moves you or something that makes you think. And so that acknowledgement of the viewer as being integral to the creation of the work and even central subject to the artist's works themselves. The art forms that they used were often intentionally those that didn't produce a finished object. And that meant that their work could not easily be bought and sold, and it didn't need to be shown or seen in a formal gallery or museum situation. So you can see that backlash to the commercialization that I was talking about just moments ago. The term conceptual art itself was first used to reference this moment in an article that was written by the artist Saul LeWitt in 1967 for Art Forum. And in this article, he said, "In conceptual art, the idea or the concept is the most important aspect of the work. When an artist uses a conceptual form of art, it means that all of the planning and decisions are made beforehand, and the execution is a perfunctory affair." So as I said, before we jump into the work of the 60s and the 70s and the work of Saul LeWitt and others from this time, I want to look back for a moment at what many consider to be kind of the origins of conceptual art. And so we're going to go ahead and we're going to start with this guy. These are two works by the artist Marcel Duchamp, who is often seen as an important forefather of conceptual art. What you're looking at are two examples of what Marcel Duchamp called ready-mades. He said about this, "In 1913, I had the happy idea to fasten a bicycle wheel to a kitchen stool and watch it turn. In New York in 1915, I bought a hardware store shovel on which I wrote, 'In advance of the broken arm.' It was around that time that the word ready-made came to mind to designate this form of manifestation." So these ready-mades, as you can see here, are really manufactured consumer products turned art. And they revolutionize the possibilities for art making. These objects were not necessarily selected because of their aesthetic qualities or because of their artness. Duchamp was interested in the artist's choice of objects, the choice that forces the viewer to see the works in a new way or in a new light. There's an emphasis here on that sort of intellectual component. The viewer must complete the artwork and participate in its interpretation. In fact, Marcel Duchamp said that a work of art wasn't complete until the viewer stood before it and participated in its completion. His ready-made fountain here of 1917 is often cited as the first conceptual artwork. Now this work has a fun story behind it, so I want to tell you a bit about that story if you're not familiar with it. Marcel Duchamp acquired the lavatory urinal from, or for the original fountain, directly from J.L. Mott Iron Works, a manufacturer of plumbing equipment. And he had planned to submit it anonymously to an exhibition that was to be open to all works of art, sponsored by the Society for Independent Artists. And the exhibition was to be held at the Grand Central Palace in New York. I should say that Duchamp was a founding member of this organization. And some say that he wanted to sort of expose the hypocrisy of his colleagues' liberal attitudes by provoking them with a work like this or a submission like this. Before submitting the piece to the exhibition as a piece of sculpture, Duchamp rotated the urinal 90 degrees from its normal functional position and left the piece basically unembellished except for the inscription R. Mutt 1917, something that we can interpret as kind of the classic artist's signature and date on the work. Duchamp was quoted as explaining his signature, saying that Mutt comes from Mott Works, the R.L. Mott Works, the name of the equipment manufacturer. But Mott, he said, was too close, so he altered it to Mutt, which was a reference to the daily cartoon strip Mutt and Jeff, which appeared at the time and with which everyone was familiar. So a bit of a wordplay here. Apparently, following a discussion and a vote, the directors who were present during the installation of the show at the Grand Central Palace, and there were about 10 of them, according to a report in the New York Herald, these 10 directors narrowly decided on behalf of the entire board to exclude the submission from the Society's exhibition that opened to the public on the 10th of April in 1917. Duchamp was outraged by this and resigned in protest against the board, taking it upon itself to veto and effectively censor the artist's work. Responding to press interest in the affair, the board issued a statement defending its position, saying, "The fountain may be a very useful object in its place, but its place is not in an art exhibition, and it is, by no definition, a work of art." Now, this whole incident was written about in the journal The Blind Man in an article called The Richard Mutt Case. This was an article that was published in May of 1917. And in this article, Duchamp said about this incident, and also specifically about the director's response that fountain is not a work of art. He said, whether Mr. Mutt chose with his own hands, or whether Mr. Mutt with his own hands made the fountain or not has no importance. He chose it. He created a new thought for that object. There are different accounts about whether or not this work was actually in situ but unseen behind a curtain, or whether it was not present at all. I mean, it wasn't visible to the public during the exhibition, but it was available, or at least available enough for Alfred Stieglitz to photograph the work. And according to a letter, Stieglitz had photographed this work on April 19th in 1917. And this becomes a really important document in recording the work's existence. I should say that it's important to know that Duchamp was not publicly known as the creator of this work at the time. He later explained that he had not made his identity known because of his position in the Society's board. He said that if his fellow board members had known he'd submitted Fountain, their response might have been different. And he would have put his friends and colleagues in a potentially difficult position. Also, Duchamp at that point was well-known and respected artist. And so he didn't want that to be an influencing factor on whether or not the work was shown. He really wanted to challenge this idea of the open invitation. And the fact that Armut was an unknown artist meant that Duchamp could test this openness of the society to artworks that didn't conform to conventional aesthetics, without compromising his relationship with the board members. Now, something that's interesting here is I mentioned that Stieglitz's photograph of the work is important to assert the existence of the work, because the work went missing, or maybe it was destroyed, and there's no sort of consensus about what happened to it, but it was not available after that moment. So it wasn't until 1963 when the Pasadena Museum of Art was organizing the first retrospective of Duchamp's work, and they were really interested in including the wide variety of Marcel Duchamp's works, including his ready-mades, including this piece. And so it was around this time that Duchamp authorized a number of replicas of his ready-mades, many of which, not just Fountain, but many others which had been lost. And so in 1964, he entrusted the Galleria Schwartz in Milan with the production of a signed and numbered edition of his most important ready-mades, including this one. Each ready-made was refabricated by a highly exacting craftsperson to replicate the original, and the edition for each selection was limited to 8 signed examples. And this version of Fountain, the Arturo Schwartz edition of Fountain that SF MoMA has in its collection, is the 4th full-scale version of the piece. It's the only edition to be issued under the direct supervision of Duchamp at every stage of the project, on the basis of a blueprint that was then derived from Stieglitz's photo of the lost original. So I think interesting story, and one of the takeaways that I want you to carry forward as we look at other works is this idea of Duchamp emphasizing the artist's thinking over the craftsmanship or the artist's manipulation of materials. He said, "I was interested in ideas, not merely in visual products. I wanted to put painting," and he's using painting kind of loosely here to embody all art forms, so art, once again, at the service of the mind. So one more look at a work before the 1960s moment, as we think about some of these sort of bedrocks or touchstones for the conceptual artists of the 1960s, is a work here by Robert Rauschenberg. And I love this work. This is Rauschenberg's Erased de Kooning drawing, a work from 1953. And what I think I want to do next is I want to play you a video of Rauschenberg talking about the origin of this work, and also then the process for its creation. So I'm going to move to this next slide and get our video going. So pay attention to some of the kinds of things he says about his interest in this work, why he made this work, and how he made this work.
Well, we just left the white painting, and so I was working with no image. And so I love drawing. And so I was trying to figure out a way to do drawings for this series, the all white. So I thought the only way to do it is like with an erasure. When I just erased my own drawings, it wasn't art yet. And so I thought, aha, it has to be art. And Bill de Kooning was the best known acceptable American artist that could be indisputably considered art. And so I bought a bottle of Jack Daniels and hoped that he wouldn't be home when I knocked on his door. And he was home. And we sat down with the Jack Daniels, and I told him what my project was. He understood it. And he said, okay, I don't like it, but I'm going to go along with it because I understand the idea. He went through one portfolio and he said, no, it'll have to be something that I'll miss. And then I'm thinking, it doesn't have to be something you're going to miss. And then he went through his second portfolio, which I thought was kind of interesting, things he wouldn't miss and things he would miss. And then he said, I'm going to make it so hard for you to erase this. And he had a third portfolio that had crayon, pencil, charcoal, and it took me about a month. And I don't know how many erasers to do it. But actually, you know, on the other side of this is also, I mean, if there's ever any question about this is a gorgeous drawing of Bill's. So when I titled it, it was very difficult to figure out exactly how to phrase this. And Jasper Johns was living upstairs, so I asked him to do the writing. It's not a negation, it's a celebration. It's just an idea.
I love that interview. I love him recounting the story of hoping that William de Kooning wouldn't be home. But a few things that strike me every time I hear Robert Rauschenberg talk about the making of this work, you know, sort of the emphatic, it's the idea, right? The concept here was important to him. The other thing about that idea is that he couldn't make the work that he wanted to make by erasing his own art. He had to, in fact, use a work of art by an artist who had already been sort of vetted and established and revered as an artist with a capital A. We see, obviously, the unorthodox materials. There's almost a performative aspect to this work. Can you imagine him with, you know, all those erasers sitting there for a month trying to erase this masterwork? And then, of course, the inclusion of text. Text also done by a collaborator, his friend, and at one time partner, the artist Jasper Johns. So with thinking about this as yet another precursor to this 1960s moment, let's turn our attention now to the work of Sol LeWitt. And here's an early work, Sol LeWitt's. And in these early works, you can see LeWitt's interest in reducing his visual vocabulary to sort of the most essential elements. In this case, the square, but also the cube, the arc, the grid. He then expanded these basic forms by repeating them serially and by detailing simple changes from one to the next. So what you're looking at here is a work that has multiple components called incomplete open cubes, where you see him arranging similar units in logical structures, exploring the progression and the permutation of the cube. both in terms of its three-dimensional components, as well as the two-dimensional documentation of it in the works that are on the wall, which are actually part of the whole work. And then he, in 1968, moved into a series of works called the drawing series, these wall drawings. And so you're looking at two works that were in SF MoMA's Boda atrium. They've since been replaced. These walls have since been replaced with works by Julie Maritou. But here you see these wall drawings that were installed directly onto these walls in the museum's atrium there. What I want to show you here, though, is really what I want to get to with Lewitt's work is that the work, on the one hand, does not need to exist in the colorful form that you would have seen it in the building many years ago. The work can exist and does exist through a series of drawings and instructions and even a certificate. And so each piece consists of a simple set of instructions or a diagram to be followed and executed directly onto the wall. The works are purposefully temporal and can be produced not only by the artist himself, but also by other draftsmen, such as studio assistants. And since his passing, this is obviously integral to be able to continue to present the works without the artist needing to be present. The artist here, Lewitt, is placing the emphasis on the concept, the idea of the work, rather than its physical manifestation. Lewitt wrote, "When an artist uses a conceptual form of art, it means that all of the planning and decisions are made beforehand. As we said, the idea becomes the machine that makes the art." And because they're serial, he's rejecting this idea or this authority invested in the singular, the precious, the original work of art in favor of the repeatable. And because they're impermanent, he's privileging the momentary over the monumental and emphasizing the thought behind these works rather than the work's materiality or physical form. I love that there's this wonderful quote from one of the crew from the New York MoMA's team who works on installing works, saying, "There's something wonderful and comforting about the fact that these works can't be ruined. They can be created and destroyed a million times over, but they will not be lost. They exist as ideas." Yeah, I want to go back to one of the other first images that I showed you, a work by the artist Joseph Kosuth, a work called 1 and 3 Chairs from 1965. And obviously in this work, what we see is the presentation of the work consisting of a chair, its photo, and a blow up of a definition of the word chair. He's chosen the definition from the dictionary. And so you see here this idea of text, of the idea of chairness. We're asked to really think about, how do we know what a chair is? Here's another example of playing with that same idea of the idea of the work. These are his word paintings. This one's my favorite. A painting, right? It is a painting. It is an actual object, but it's also the definition, the textual definition of what a painting is. So really playing with this idea of text and language as conjuring up these objects, while also then affirming but negating the objectness of the painting, of the work. Sometimes I feel like we end up in double talk when we're talking about conceptual art. On this idea of text and object is an example here by the artist Onkawara, who starting in the mid-60s created nearly 3,000 acrylic paintings, which feature only the dates on which they were made, the month, the day, and the year, inscribed on these layered grounds of paint, in this case gray, but he's also made them in red and blue. And the date paintings are all rendered in the same font. It's a sans serif style font without the aid of stencils. They come in different sizes, 8 different sizes, the smallest ones measuring 8 by 10 inches and the largest one 61 by 89 inches. And if Ankawara couldn't finish a day's painting by midnight, he destroyed it. I love this idea of making a painting within a day, and if you can't complete it, then it needs to be destroyed. It doesn't exist. He also sometimes, and you can see this in this image, would make a cardboard box for each painting that he would line with part of the local newspaper from that day's edition. There's no apparent attention to what had been reported in that paper. The pages may stir nostalgia, or in the case of those that were accompanying paintings made during the Vietnam War, they might revive nightmares. And so this idea of the idea of making a work of art and the unconventional materials and the use of text and even the performative aspect of it, you see being carried through in some of the main ideas that were concerning artists at this time. I'm going to show you another example by the artist Lawrence Weiner called Pearls Rolled Across the Floor. In 1968, Lawrence Weiner relinquished the physical making of his work and formulates what he calls declaration of intent, which was one of the most important conceptual art statements following Saul LeWitt's paragraphs on conceptual art. And in the declaration, he underscores his subsequent practice, saying that the artist may construct the piece may be fabricated, the piece need not be built, and each being equal and consistent with the intent of the artist. The decision as to condition rests with the receiver upon the occasion of receivership. So just to kind of unpack that a bit, the artist can make the piece, but he doesn't have to. It could be fabricated, but it doesn't have to be. And the intent of the artist based on the condition actually lives with us. It's our job. We're completing the work. And so we're being required to complete this work. We're required to conjure up the images that are presented here in this work in our mind's eye. The text merely suggests the idea of the subject of the work, and it doesn't represent it in that classic or Renaissance sense of painting as a window onto the natural world. Likewise, this idea of conjuring up or performing or enacting or imagining the work of art is exemplified by the work of Yoko Ono. And here I'm showing you on the left Grapefruit, which was her influential first book, which was published in 1964, and was originally published by her own imprint in an edition of 500. And on the right is an example of one of the pieces that you would find in Grapefruit. And so again, here in this instruction work, if you will, you are asked to conjure up the idea of this work in your mind's eye and therefore complete the work. You in fact make the work happen by imagining that snow is falling everywhere all the time. And when you talk with a person, think that snow is falling between you and the person. Stop conversing when you think the person is covered by snow. I'm going to share a personal example of a Yoko Ono work that I experienced in New York in, I guess it was summer of 2019. And this is a work called Add Color Refugee Boat. It's an installation. It's participatory. You can see my son there participating in the making of the work. It's a collaboration between the viewer and the artist. The work is as it was presented in this situation as a stage on which to exercise collective opinion, hopes, and dreams related to all forms of the international refugee crisis. And so the installation starts out as a white room with a rowboat and a framed text that reads, "Add color, refugee boat, just blue like the ocean." And then there are different kinds of paint and mark making materials in shades of blue, and viewers are asked to activate the installation by making their marks, by reading what others have written, by listening to what others have said, to understanding how people are feeling, and then exercising our own voice in response. And without our participation, the room would remain blank, a blank white slate, so that the meaning comes from these acts of engagement. I want to take a moment to skip ahead and look at an example or two of work by artists that we might not necessarily consider sort of formally part of that conceptual art moment of the 60s and 70s, and stretch a bit into the next decades. With looking at a couple of works by the artist Jenny Holzer. Holzer really turned to strategies of mass media and advertising in her work. And what you're seeing here is an example of a number of works that Holzer made in the end of the 70s called truisms, which included about 300 epigrams and slogans consisting of or composed of modern cliches or commonly held truths. Originally, these appeared as anonymous posters and broadsheets that were wheat pasted to buildings and walls and telephone booths around Manhattan. They also took the form of stickers that you could find in these public spaces, and even t-shirts. And eventually they were seen, as you're seeing it here, as large-scale installations in places like Times Square. In her work, she really confronts in its blunt recognition the violence, inequities, and oppression of the often invisible but felt systems that govern our world. She hoped these ideas and opinions would sharpen people's awareness of the quote unquote baloney they are fed every day. Here's another example, a piece from a different body of work called the Survival Series. A bench, functional, you can sit on it, on which text is engraved into the granite, "Men don't protect you anymore." And it's visually subtle. You might even miss it as you sit on the object, but once you see it, it can't be unseen. And so for Holzer, her works are very much about the experience of the text. And the texts in the Survivor series are ones that expressed Holzer's own political and social positions, her ideology, her own ideas. She said in a 1986 New York Times profile that I wanted to support things that are helpful to people and maybe bash at what I think is dangerous. So I switched from being everybody to being myself. So this is the difference between the truisms, which were more anonymous, and these, which in fact are her own ideas, her own expressions, her own beliefs. And much of Holzer's work, was really born in this moment of feminism and representations of women's experiences through language. The text explores experiences of misogyny and violence, oppression and power relations, as well as socio-political constructions of sexuality and femininity. And to consider the phrase, "men don't protect you anymore," there may be personal experiences that are raised for viewers. A viewer may have questions like, who is the you that's referenced here, and what is the experience of being protected? Of course, Holzer's works don't answer these questions. They leave them for us to generate and consider on our own. In other words, we must complete the work. I want to share another example that I find some similarities between the work here by Lorna Simpson and some of Jenny Holzer's ideas in their in the use particularly of text, this convention that the conceptual artists of the 60s really embraced. And so you're looking at a work here by Lorna Simpson called Necklines. This work shows the image of a Black woman, three slightly different vantage points, but all of these images are focused on her neck. And below the images are two text boxes with the words necktie, neck and neck, naked, necklace, necking, neckline, necklace, breakneck. And the words in relation to the image changes our perspective on the meaning behind these photographs. I like to think also about how someone like Joseph Kosuth in his chair, and the 1 in 3 chairs uses the text, the words about chair to also sort of feed into our understanding of the image of the chair and the actual chair. So in this way too, the word in relation to the images gets us to think again about the meaning behind these photographs. I love this phrase, this description of this work and of Simpson's work that was included in the opening of an exhibition of her work at Hauser and Wirth in 2019. It says, the works entangle the viewers into an equivocal web of meaning with what is unseen and left unsaid, as important as that which the artist does disclose. These juxtapositions really call our attention to this sort of relationship between image and text, and really displays the sort of the complexities that are inherent in the experiences, particularly of African Americans, making us recognize that the lives of Black people are continuously shaped by how society has regarded them throughout history. And although Simpson's pieces are most obviously about race and gender politics, she has also described her work as being influenced by this idea of memory. And I want to take that to look at one last artist with you today. So here you are looking at two works by the artist Felix Gonzalez Torres. These are candy spills, and he began these candy spills in 1990. You see them, that they feature large quantities of colorful wrapped candies that are heaped in corners and spread out across the floor. They have a visual and formal and sculptural quality to them, but they also have the potential to morph and change. They're not all glued together. They're actually loose, piles of candy. And visitors are encouraged to take pieces of the candy home with them, or to actually eat the candy and let it dissolve, let it be ephemeral in some of the same ways that Saul LeWitt's wall drawings are ephemeral. When they need to come down, the wall gets painted. These works are tied emotionally to the loss of Gonzalez Torres's long-term partner, Ross Laycock, who died of AIDS complications in 1991. And Gonzalez Torres said that I wanted to make an artwork that could disappear, that never existed, and that was a metaphor for when Ross was dying. So it was a metaphor that I could abandon this work before it would abandon me. So this idea of memory, but also the idea of these works as representing someone that Felix Gonzalez Torres loved and lost. His works are often about generosity. We're asked to take something, we're asked to engage with the work. In fact, if we don't, without the public, he said, these works are nothing. I need the public to complete the work. I ask the public to help me, to take responsibility, to become part of my work, to join in. You're looking here at a curtain of gold beads that are suspended from the ceiling that we're asked to pass through. The work isn't complete until, in fact, we walk through it, we experience it, we participate with it and engage with it. The last work I'll leave you with here, and this is my conceptual art shot. This is, you can make out maybe, if you look really carefully, at the very top of the wall of this gallery, you see a bunch of words, phrases, and dates. This is a work untitled from 1989. That really is in many ways a kind of a self-portrait, artist self-portrait. I apologize for the ambulance that's driving by in the background, if you can hear that. And it consists of a number of phrases and dates, things like Ross, 1983, or Our Own Apartment, 1976. It's a work that gets interacted with, in fact, by the institution that's presenting it, because the institutions are given the option, in fact, the obligation to consider adding or even subtracting events, including ones subsequent to the artist's death, ensuring that the work remains relevant and dynamic. And so when SF MoMA has exhibited this work, we've added a couple of things, including San Francisco Gay Marriages 2004 and Barack Obama 2008. I mentioned that this is my own conceptual slide to leave you with, because here I am in the gallery standing under this work. But if you look carefully at the detail, you'll see Julie 1987. So I found personal relevance in this work to find my name and a date that resonates for me, because that was, I think, as Rebecca said, that was about the date of my birth. Just kidding. But this idea that these are sort of sometimes personal memories from the artist, but sometimes these collective memories that we've partaken in ourselves or experienced ourselves. And so with that, I'm going to leave you with a parting slide here, and we'll move into questions. This is a work by San Francisco artist Tom Marioni, a conceptual work that he activated in his studios for years, called the act of drinking beer with friends is the highest form of art. And so while it may be a little too soon for some of us to crack open the beer, I do hope that this evening you might pour yourself a drink and have a conversation with those around you about what is art, what's your criteria for art, and has it changed any since we've talked together this afternoon. So with that, I'd love to open it up to questions.
Julie, thank you so much. We really appreciate your coming. And for all of you who have been with us today, I guarantee you, when you go outside, everything is going to look like art to you. It's just wonderful when you spend some time with Julie Charles.
Thank you.
And I think I have to start my video again. Okay, nope, it was on. Okay, so Julie, we do have a question. How is the viewer so important to conceptual art?
Yeah, that's a great question, and hopefully I did sort of make that as one of my points, that that is one of these things about conceptual art, that we need to complete it in many ways. It's one of the elements that makes the conceptual art piece what it is, and since conceptual art really is based on sort of ideation and sort of the like the minimization of the object itself. The viewer, instead of just looking at something, and sort of relying on the artist to tell us what it means, or to we're fully engaged in making the work, right? I think the Lawrence Weiner piece or Yoko Ono piece are great examples of that. Lawrence Weiner's piece is just words on a wall, but it comes to life when we in fact imagine, pearls rolling across the floor, or in Yoko Ono's piece, imagine snow falling. And that's really where the work, in fact, comes alive. It becomes a thing.
All right. We do have a couple of other questions, Julie. How is the viewer so important to art?
Right. Again, that idea of the viewer
Oh.
really completing the work, and in some ways, in some of these works, with things that, and maybe not even the viewer. I think that actually, I'll take this as an opportunity to think about Sol LeWitt's work. If Sol LeWitt's work was dependent on the artist doing it, what would we do today? Sol LeWitt's no longer with us. He's passed away. And if the works are intended to be painted out, the wall drawings are intended to be painted out, how would they ever be reinstalled and represented, right? So it involves other people. And in this case, maybe not the viewer, but although, I guess technically, if you had instructions for Sol LeWitt, you could make your own work. And in the true spirit of his initial, sort of intent, that would be a Sol LeWitt work.
And my dear friend Linda Chittenden asked, often in a museum, my experience with conceptual art has left me feeling stupid. I don't get it. What can museums do to help the viewer?
Yeah, I want to acknowledge that. It's a great point. I want to acknowledge that oftentimes with modern and contemporary art in general, there's this feeling that, it's sort of insider baseball. You need to know something to be able to understand that. And that's certainly true. In some cases, that sort of a layer of contextual information can really unlock, a work of art. And I think that, conceptual art particularly leaves people kind of scratching their heads. I think that museums particularly are also grappling with how can we provide opportunities to engage with the work in a way that doesn't, make people feel stupid. So whether it's providing some of those sort of contextual information that are keys to unlocking the piece in the form of some wall labels or an audio tour, or our guides giving tours. I think that, and I think that some of these works are, they are kind of humorous and funny and absurd. And I think it's okay for us to actually respond in some of those ways. In fact, we're completing the work in a different kind of way. So.
All right, that's helpful, I think, Julie. Barbara wants to know, conjuring and fabrication of concept seems to dovetail somewhat with artists who create media for corporations, and that the ideas are protected by the corporation, not the individual, under intellectual property laws.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are some artists. At one point, I was going to include the artist Sherry Levine in here, and then I had too many. So you throw everything in the kitchen sink, and you have to start taking things out. But Sherry Levine is an artist who actually has gotten into some sticky situations around the idea of say copyright in her own appropriation of other artists' works. And so this idea of sort of intellectual copyright or intellectual domain absolutely, I think, is this sort of a thread that kind of gets tangled up in the idea, in the ideas and in the presentations in many cases of these conceptual artworks.
Thank you. We have another question. Where does Clifford Stillman, I think it might be Clifford Still, fall into the conceptual art movement? Is he before or after it?
Yeah, so Clifford Still is an artist who oftentimes is really associated with kind of the Bay Area version of abstract expressionism. So this moment in art in sort of the 50s, the late 50s, when artists are really, and this is championed by the art historian and art critic Clement Greenberg, who's talking about sort of the artist as creating these very emotional, personal, sort of visual expressions of the subconscious, or these larger ideas about humanity. And in fact, when Rauschenberg said that he wanted to, he had to go to de Kooning to get an art object that had been championed as art with a capital A. Clifford Still is very much in that same moment. Clifford Still and Mark Rothko, in fact, were good friends. Rothko, an artist who had been here in San Francisco, but predominantly considered a New York school artist. But Clifford Still and Mark Rothko would send their paintings back and forth to each other to sort of comment on each other's work and ideas. So art historically, we'd say that Clifford Still is sort of in this moment before conceptual art as a movement.
Thank you. Linda Rosa would like to know, some conceptual art appears very simplistic. What makes a particular piece of art another piece not? Is it the artist's reputation, education, connections?
Is the question about what makes it simplistic, or in terms of, can you repeat the question so I'm understanding?
Certainly. Some conceptual art appears very simplistic. What makes a particular piece art, in quotes, and another piece not? Is it the artist's reputation, education, or connections? Yes.
So sometimes all of those things come into play, right? I think one of the things that we often hear at the museum when people are encountering, for example, at the very beginning, even of Rauschenberg. So we wouldn't necessarily say that Rauschenberg is technically a conceptual artist at that movement in the 60s, but you saw at the very beginning of that video an all-white painting. I should say one-color paintings often make our museum visitors crazy. Very simplistic at this idea of like, why is that art, right? And so some of it does have to do with sort of the connections. One thing to note is that the conceptual artists, someone like Sol LeWitt, Lawrence Weiner, they're writing about it, they're part of the discourse, and they're part of creating that they are there. So all of those things that you mentioned, whether it's, education, connections, whether it's, sort of exposure, whether it's an articulation of ideas that then get adopted by the art world and by the public, all of these things can be a determining factor in this idea of art.
Thank you, Julie. I think we've come to the end of our session today, but I can't tell you how much I enjoyed it. And most of all, it makes me realize how much I miss going to the museum. So I know we'll all be flocking down there pretty soon, I hope.
We hope so.
Yeah. So, Julie, we really do appreciate your coming or coming virtually to us today. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you all for your questions and your participation.
Okay, I have the next public event. I know you will want to make sure that you're available for this one. The Outdoor Art Club's next public event will be held a week from today, March 4th at 1 p.m. In that webinar, you can garden for life. Author and motivational speaker Tony Gattoni, or Gatton, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, I'm sorry, will discuss gardening and sustainability. She will offer a wide range of strategies to help you enjoy gardening well into old age. You can register for this and all future webinars at the Outdoor Art Club website under public events. If you are interested in continuing to learn about future public events at the Outdoor Art Club, please visit the public events page on our website and sign up to be on our email list. Thank you again for everyone joining us today. We hope that we will see you again very soon.